Once in control of the Armory, Brown detailed his men to other objectives. Oliver Brown and William Thompson were sent to watch the bridge across the Shenandoah River, while Hazlitt and Edwin Coppock moved into the unguarded arsenal. Another group of raiders under Stevens made its way down Shenandoah Street to the rifle factory on Lower Hall Island. Again, the watchman was surprised and easily captured. Telling Coggy and Copeland to watch the rifle work, Stevens marched the watchman and several young men picked up on the street back to the Armory grounds. About midnight, another watchman, Patrick Higgins, arrived at the Maryland end of the B&O Bridge to relieve Williams. Finding the structure dark, he called out loudly. He was answered quietly by Taylor and Watson Brown, who took him prisoner. As he was being escorted across the bridge, Higgins suddenly lashed out, struck Brown in the face, and raced toward the town. Taylor fired after him. The ball grazed the watchman's scalp, but he reached the wager house safely. The first shot of the raid had been fired. Stevens led several raiders on a special mission to capture Colonel Lewis W. Washington, the 46-year-old great-grandnephew of George Washington. The colonel, a prosperous planter, lived about 5 miles west of Harper's Ferry. He owned a pistol presented to General Washington by the Marquis de Lafayette and a sword reportedly presented by the Prussian King Frederick the Great. Brown wanted these weapons. When he struck the first blow to free the slaves, he rather fancied the idea of wearing the sword and brandishing the pistol once owned by the man who had led the fight to free the American colonists from a similar kind of tyranny. Battering down Washington's door, Stevens and his crew summoned the colonel from his bed. Washington offered no resistance. Calmly surrendering the sword and pistol, he then dressed and climbed into his carriage for the trip to Harper's Ferry. When asked by Washington what the performance meant, Stevens said, "We have come here for the purpose of liberating all the slaves of the South, and we are able, or propose to do it," or words to that effect. The caravan moved to the John H. Allstott home, where the front door was broken down with a fence rail, and Allstott and his son, together with his adult male slaves, were taken into custody, and all were driven to Harper's Ferry and delivered to Brown at the Armory. While Stevens' party was gathering hostages, the first death occurred. At 1:25 in the morning, the Baltimore and Ohio passenger train eastbound for Baltimore arrived at Harper's Ferry and was stopped by a clerk from the wager house who told conductor A.J. Phelps of the recent startling events. Phelps refused to allow the train to cross the bridge until it had been checked, and he sent engineer William McKay and baggage master Jacob Cromwell out to investigate. They were halted by Brown's guards, who turned them back at gunpoint. Hayward Shepard, the station baggage handler, heard the commotion and walked out to see what was going on. Shepard, a free black man, was highly respected and well liked by all who knew him. As he approached the bridge, a raider told him to halt. Instead, Shepard turned around and started back toward the station. A shot rang out and he fell gravely wounded. He dragged himself back to the station, where he died the next afternoon. The first person to die at the hands of the men who had come to free the slaves was, in fact, a black man already free. Brown's army settled down at their posts in the waning darkness to await the coming of day, the last for many of them. Thus far, the citizens of Harper's Ferry had offered no resistance to the invasion of their town, primarily because most of the townspeople knew nothing of what was taking place. The first alarm of what was occurring in the town was given out by a resident physician, Dr. John D. Starry. The doctor was aroused from his slumbers by the firing of the shot that struck Hayward, and went to his relief. The remainder of the night he spent in observing what was going on, but gave out no information concerning it. At daylight he saddled his horse, rode to the residence of A.M. Kitzmiller, who was in charge of the arsenal, acquainted him and a number of other officials and workmen with the story of the night. He then put spurs to his horse, and ascended the hill to Bolivar Heights, where he awoke some more sleepers. After arousing the town, the doctor rode to Charlestown, 8 miles distant, where the alarm was given by ringing all the bells. To Charlestown residents, the news from Harper's Ferry was frightening, for it awakened memories of the 1831 Nat Turner slave rebellion in Virginia's Tidewater region, when more than 50 whites, mostly women and children, were murdered before the bloody uprising was put down. the local military company, the Jefferson Guards, fell in promptly. Also a second company, composed of men and boys, was organized on the spot, both companies taking a train at 10 o'clock for the scene of the trouble. Eventually 16 companies of state volunteers were assembled at Harper's Ferry within 12 hours from the time the first alarm was given out. Soon after Starry began his ride, the residents of Harper's Ferry discovered a supply of guns in a building overlooked by the raiders, and some of the townspeople began to move against Brown and his men. Grocer Thomas Borley, a man of great physical strength and courage, approached the same corner and opened fire on a group of Brown's men across the street from the Armory gate. A return bullet knocked him down with a ghastly wound, from which he soon died. After 10 o'clock, the citizens of Harper's Ferry became aggressive, and opened a scattering fire upon Brown's position at the Armory building. The Jefferson Guards, upon their arrival at Bolivar Heights, marched to a point about a mile above the town, where they crossed the Potomac in boats, and came down the Maryland side of the river to the Potomac Bridge, driving Watson, Brown and Taylor from their post. This movement compelled William Thompson and Newby to abandon their station at the Shenandoah Bridge, and seek shelter in the Armory. Up until noon of October 17, despite the erratic fire from the townspeople, the raiders could have fought their way to retreat in the mountains. Instead, Brown waited, doing nothing. By midday it was too late to flee, and the jaws of the steel trap foreseen by Frederick Douglass closed swiftly. It was fast becoming evident that his plans had miscarried, that the slaves had failed to strike for their freedom, that the fundamental movement of the campaign, the insurrection of the slave ship, had not been executed. The blow which he planned to strike had not been delivered. The attempt had, in his words, flashed in the pan. During the afternoon Brown sought to have the firing cease by negotiating with the citizens for a truce, and sent out a prisoner, Mr. Cross, and William Thompson, to make the arrangement. Thompson was immediately taken and held as a prisoner, for a time, at the Galt House. Later he was led out upon the trestle leading to the Shenandoah Bridge, where he was shot by a mob. His body fell into the shallow water below, where it became a general target for the mob. About 1 o'clock Lehman sought to effect his escape. He left the arsenal and attempted to cross the Potomac, a short distance above the bridge, and succeeded in getting as far as a small island in the river, where he was overtaken and killed. The body of the late captain, his commission in his pocket, as it lay upon the rocks in the river, became another object for target practice. Meanwhile, Coggy, still at the rifle factory, was anxiously sending messages to Brown urging him to leave Harper's Ferry while they still had the chance. Brown ignored the pleas and continued to direct operations with no apparent thought that outside forces would be moving against him once the alarm had spread. Trying to parley a truce, Brown sent Stevens and Watson Brown out under a flag of truce. This flag was fired upon from the windows of the Galt House with the result that both Stevens and Brown received severe wounds. Brown succeeded in dragging himself back to the Armory engine house, where he died 30 hours later. When a raider shot and killed George Turner about 2 p.m., the crowd grew ugly. Turner, a West Point graduate, was a prominent and highly respected area planner. When Fontaine Beckham, the mayor of Harper's Ferry and agent for the B&O Railroad, was killed, the townspeople turned into a howling, raging mob. Beckham, a well-liked man of somewhat high-strung temperament, had been greatly disturbed by the earlier shooting of Hayward Shepherd, his friend at the depot. Despite warnings from friends to keep away, Beckham, unarmed, walked out on the railroad to see what was going on. He paced up and down the B&O trestle bordering the Armory yard about 30 yards from the engine house. Several raiders spotted him peering around the water tower in front of their stronghold and thought that he was placing himself in position to fire through the doors. Edwin Coppock, posted at the doorway of the engine house, leveled his rifle at the mayor and pulled the trigger. Beckham fell, a bullet through his heart. Oliver Brown, standing beside Coppock in the partly open doorway, aimed his rifle at another man on the trestle, but before he could fire he keeled over with a mortal wound. Both of Brown's sons now lay dying at their father's feet. Between 2 and 3 o'clock a small party made an attack upon the rifle works on the Shenandoah, where Coggy and his men were stationed. Seeing the futility of their defense, The men tried to reach the Shenandoah River. Kagi fell and died in the water. Leary was mortally wounded, and died the following night. Copeland, a free black, reached the rock only to be dragged ashore, where the excited crowd screamed to lynch him. But Dr. Starry intervened, and the frightened man was hustled off to jail. On the other side of the Potomac, Cook, Owen Brown, Barclay Coppock, Miriam, Tidd, and several freed slaves had been transferring weapons to a tiny schoolhouse midway between Harper's Ferry and the Kennedy farm. As the day wore on and the firing from town became heavier, they began to suspect that something might have gone wrong. At about 4 p.m. Cook headed for the B&O Bridge to see what was happening. To get a better vantage point, he climbed the craggy face of Maryland Heights where he could look directly into the center of the town. Seeing that his compatriots were completely surrounded, he decided to try to take some of the pressure off by firing across the river at men posted in the houses overlooking the Armory. His shot was instantly answered by a volley of bullets that severed a branch he was clutching for support and sent him tumbling down the rocky cliff. Badly cut and bruised from the fall, he limped back to the schoolhouse and joined the others. Realizing there was nothing they could do to aid their comrades trapped in the engine house, they reluctantly gathered their belongings, climbed the mountain and headed north. The rest of the party met with better success, Cook alone being arrested. He was taken at Chambersburg, October 25, and returned to Charlestown, where he was hanged December 16. Edwin Coppock, Green, and Copeland were hanged at the same time. The others, Tidd, Barclay Coppock, Miriam and Owen Brown all succeeded in making good their escape. The slaves who had been taken were returned to their masters. Brown, knowing escape was impossible, again attempted to bargain for freedom. In verbal and written pleas he offered to release his hostages if he and his men were allowed to leave unmolested. Prisoners, slaves, and raiders alike settled down, as best they could, to what would be a long and depressing night. Only 5 of the raiders were still unwounded and able to hold a rifle: Brown himself, Edwin Coppock, J.G. Anderson, Dauphin Thompson, and Shields Green. Stuart Taylor, the Canadian soldier of fortune, lay dead in a corner, his presentiment of death come true. He had been shot like Oliver Brown while standing at the engine house doorway. Oliver himself, writhing in pain, begged to be killed and put out of his misery. "If you must die, then die like a man," were the last words the father said to his son. After a while Oliver was quiet. "I guess he is dead," Brown said. Nearby, Watson Brown lay quietly breathing his last. The attack that had begun but 24 hours before was fast coming to an end. The somberness that permeated the fire engine house contrasted sharply with the din outside. Hundreds of militiamen and townspeople jammed the streets, which echoed with whoops and yells. The bars in the Wager House and Galt House Saloon were enjoying an unprecedented business. Many men were intoxicated, and they fired their guns wildly into the air and occasionally at the engine house. All semblance of order was gone. In the confusion, the detail at the Arsenal Hazlitt and O.P. Anderson managed to escape unnoticed. It is said they first went to the Kennedy farm, where they got supplies of provisions, and from there they made their way into Pennsylvania. 5 days later Hazlitt was captured at Carlisle. His trial was had at Charlestown, and he was hanged there, with Stevens, March 16, 1860. Anderson fared better. He managed to reach Canada, and lived to write a marvelous story of his adventures. During afternoon of the 17th, President James Buchanan a detachment of Marines to the scene of the trouble. The latter were under the command of Lieutenant Israel Green. He also ordered Lieutenant Colonel Robert E. Lee to proceed to Harper's Ferry and assume command of all the United States troops there. J.E.B. Stuart, at that time a first lieutenant in the 1st United States Cavalry, accompanied Lee as a volunteer aide. At 10 o'clock Lee arrived at Sandy Hook on a special train. The Marines were then formed, and marched to Harper's Ferry. Arriving at the town, after consultation with the volunteer commanders present, Lee ordered the militia to vacate the Armory grounds, and put the control, or care of the situation, in the hands of Lieutenant Green. Stewart was ordered to go with a part of the troops to the front of the engine house and demand the surrender of the insurgent party. Colonel Lee directed him to offer protection to Brown and his men, but to receive no counter-proposition from Brown in regard to the surrender. On the way to the engine house, Stewart and Greene agreed upon a signal for attack in the event that Brown should refuse to surrender. It was simply that Lieutenant Stewart would wave his hat, one very similar to the famous cover which he wore throughout the war. Stewart hailed Brown and called for his surrender, but Brown at once began to make a proposition that he and his men should be allowed to come out of the engine house and be given the length of the bridge start, so that they might escape. Suddenly Lieutenant Stewart waved his hat. Upon seeing the signal, Greene ordered the attack. While being fired upon from within the engine house, the Marines, armed with a sledge, attempted to beat down the doors, but without success. Then seeing a heavy ladder lying nearby, Greene ordered some of the men to take it up and use it against the doors as a battering ram. 2 blows by the improvised engine of war sufficed to break a ragged hole, low down, in the right-hand door. Lieutenant Greene was the first man through. Major W. W. Russell, armed only with a rattan cane, followed immediately. Private Luke Quinn squeezed through behind Russell and took a bullet to the gut. Another Marine, Private Matthew Rupert, stepped over Quinn, then dropped his gun and clawed his face in pain where a bullet had torn through his cheek. The rest of the storming party entered without injury.
The first person I saw was Colonel Lewis Washington, who was standing near the hose cart, at the front of the engine house. On one knee, a few feet to the left, knelt a man with a carbine in his hand, just pulling the lever to reload. "Hello, Greene," said Colonel Washington, and pointed to the kneeling figure. "This is Osawatomie." As he said this, Brown turned his head to see who it was to whom Colonel Washington was speaking. Quicker than thought I brought my saber down with all my strength upon his head. He was moving as the blow fell, and I suppose I did not strike him where I intended, for he received a deep saber cut in the back of the neck. He fell senseless on his side, then rolled over on his back. He had in his hand a short Sharp's cavalry carbine. By that time 3 or 4 of my men were inside. They came rushing in like tigers, as a storming assault is not a playday sport. They bayonet one man skulking under the engine, and pinned another fellow up against the rear wall, both being instantly killed. I ordered the men to spill no more blood. The other insurgents were at once taken under arrest, and the contest ended. The whole fight had not lasted over 3 minutes. The hostages were the sorriest lot of people I ever saw. They had been without food for over 60 hours, in constant dread of being shot, and were huddled up in the corner where lay the body of Brown's son and 1 or 2 others of the insurgents who had been killed.
The battle over, Greene and Coppock were taken into custody, and the dead and wounded were carried from the engine house and laid upon the Armory lawn, where they were protected from violence by a guard detailed from the company of Marines. Brown was carried to the office of the paymaster of the Armory and there given medical attention, when it was found that his wounds were far less serious than they were at first supposed to be. Of the 22 ambitious men who undertook to organize the Provisional Army, 10 had been killed. Coggy, Oliver Brown, Watson Brown, William Thompson, Dauphin Thompson, Jeremiah G. Anderson, Lehman, Newby, Leary, and Taylor. 5 were prisoners: Brown, Stevens, E. Coppock, Greene, and Copeland. 7 had got away: Cook, Hazlitt, Tidd, Owen Brown, Barclay Coppock, O. P. Anderson, and Francis Merriam. Afternoon, Brown and Stevens, still suffering from the wounds he received on October 17, were carried to the paymaster's office where a group of inquisitors questioned them for 3 hours in an effort to learn their purpose and the names of their supporters in the North. During the interrogation, Brown lay on the floor, his hair matted and tangled, his face, hands, and clothes soiled and smeared with blood. He talked freely, and while he readily admitted his intention to free the slaves, and only that, he refused to divulge the names of his northern backers.
"No man sent me here. It was my own prompting and that of my Maker, or that of the devil, whichever you ascribe it to. I acknowledge no man in human form. I want you to understand, gentlemen, that I respect the rights of the poorest and weakest of colored people, oppressed by the slave system, just as much as I do those of the most wealthy and powerful. That is the idea that has moved me, and that alone. We expect no reward, except the satisfaction of endeavoring to do for those in distress and greatly oppressed, as we would be done by. The cry of distress of the oppressed is my reason, and the only thing that has prompted me to come here. It was my own prompting and that of my Maker, or that of the devil, whichever you ascribe it to. I acknowledge no man in human form.
The day after their capture, Brown and his surviving followers were taken to Charlestown under heavy guard and lodged in the county jail. The cell doors had hardly banged shut when they learned that they were to receive speedy trials. The 5 raiders were arraigned on October 25, just 1 week after their capture. The next day they were indicted for treason against the Commonwealth of Virginia, for conspiring with slaves to rebel, and for murder. Each defendant pleaded not guilty and each asked for a separate trial. The court consented and elected to try Brown first. The court did not take the question of Brown's guilt or innocence seriously. The trial was simply to be a dignified conformance with the laws of the Commonwealth relating to the subject. Except as to respect for this formality, it was not considered important whether Brown had any counsel at all. On the 22nd of October, one of the prosecutors in a letter to Governor Wise said, "The judge is for observing all the judicial decencies, so am I, but in double quick time. Stevens will hardly be fit for trial. He will probably die of his wounds if we don't hang him promptly." The prosecution's parade of witnesses recounted the story of the attack on Harper's Ferry, the arming of the slaves, and the deaths of Hayward Shepard, Fontaine Beckham, and George W. Turner. Brown's contention that, as commander-in-chief of a provisional army, he should be tried according to the laws of war and not as a common criminal was rejected. Other arguments offered by the defense met with equally fruitless results. Sentence was passed on November 2. John Brown would hang on Friday, December 2, 1859.